Welcome back to our Faith Forward platform. I'm John Ackerman.
I'm Brian Bales, and we are again here this week to talk about what it looks like, not just to take in the stuff that you hear on a Sunday at Christian Fellowship Church, because that's our main audience of people here go to Christian Fellowship Church in Ashburn. We know we have some other people that listen, but not just take in what you hear Sunday at Christian Fellowship Church or wherever you might attend church in person or virtually in this world that we live in, but how do we take that moment, that hour, whatever it might be, and the wisdom that God's giving us through the scriptures, and then apply it every day. Because that's the rub lots of times in life. We hear something good, and we're like, oh, yeah, and then we go out and do absolutely nothing about it. And it's not intentional. I don't think we ever say we're doing it intentional, but I think a lot of times, and that's why we're doing this, what we lack is some practical steps. And so what we bring in this podcast is not necessarily a formula that you need to do it this way, but what I would like to say, some suggestions that we believe if you're lacking in practical forward steps of doing this, we want to help you out. For example, we've talked about this before. Sometimes in churches, it works like if you moved in. So I live in Ashburn and you live in Purcellville. And, if someone just moved into Ashburn or someone just moved into Purcellville and they go, hey, where's a good restaurant to go? And either one of us go, all of them are good. You're good. What we've just been in that moment is helpfully unhelpful, right? So we've told them everything's good, but we've not given them direction. And at that point, people are looking for direction. And really, that's what this is doing. We're not saying you can't go on your own and go to some other restaurants, but we recognize that a lot of people lead a little step, a little bit of guidance. And so what we share here is some things that we've learned from Scripture, that we've learned from experience. Sometimes it's good things, sometimes it's bad things, but we want to help you on that, moving it forward. So
that's the plan.
That's the plan. That was a long-winded thing already for a startup. Yeah. So
I always like the longer explanation.
There you go. There you go.
Well, and what's interesting about this week's message from Pastor Chris, and I've got to imagine that as pastors, there are sections of Scripture that you all love to cover, and then there are times where it's got to feel like we've been here before, and how do I offer something new?
Yeah.
And this feels like it was probably one of those weeks.
Sure. I actually am kind of glad Pastor Chris was teaching this.
I was wondering.
I joke about that. People say that some of the hardest things to teach about are the things that we hear most.
Yeah.
So truthfully, as a pastor, my two hardest sermons every year are Christmas and Easter. Right. And what this also illustrates, when in Mark chapter 12, when it talks about this idea of not only loving the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, and your mind, but really this focus on loving your neighbor as yourself, what it brings out is that just because we're intellectually familiar with something doesn't mean that we're living inside of the command of it or the power of it. Like in Easter, we're talking about living from victory. I mean, we understand intellectually that Jesus accomplished the victory for us, but we often struggle living from that place. And so this is another one of those sections that people are like, oh, had it, heard it, know it. But if we're, again, just truthful, which we want to be, we can struggle from time to time, right?
And so hopefully you caught the message. And again, we'll keep saying it over and over because this really is the heart behind this platform, that this is not substitute for the Sunday service, but this is, it's follow on.
Yeah. Additional work for those people. I don't know if work is the right term. That may not be the best thing to say. But those people that would look in the footnotes and additional readings to flesh out that. I mean, some of us were just let me just get through the class. Right? Just what do you need? But some of us were would dig into this. And so we want people to dig into this because this isn't just about getting through the class. Right? We went a little farther. So we're helping that. We're hopefully helping.
We're helping.
Yeah.
So this week's message from Pastor Chris, Brian, like you said, Mark 12, Jesus teaching on the greatest command. Right? The Pharisees, others are trying to trap him into some sort of theological loophole so they can be justifiably upset with him instead of quietly upset with him. And his response about the greatest commandment is love the Lord your God with all your whole heart, soul, mind, and strength. And then the second one being very much like it, love your neighbor as yourself. And so like you said, it feels like if you've been in church any amount of time, you've probably heard a message on this 3, 4, 6, 12, 100 times.
Yeah, could be. Or 600 times, depending on how long you've been in church, right?
And so even as we were getting ready for this podcast, we were kind of looking at each other via email going, what do we talk about as far as practical application? Because it almost feels like this one creates the practical application itself. How do we love people? Go love people.
Right.
And there was definitely some wheels turning for a little bit there of where do we go with this? And I think I think we've got a couple of things that we want to offer that have value.
Yeah.
But really, just to start off, I think it's probably good to just go back to the foundational concept of why is this the greatest commandment? Why does this one matter so much?
Yeah, and you made a great point, because when Jesus says it, it says the second is like the first. So it's not saying that this is one and this is then substitute what's the word I'm looking for? Subordinate. There's the word I'm looking for. Thank you for the flexibility in this platform. It's not subordinate, but it's equal, right? And I think because one of the main ways that we love God is by loving others, right? And in fact, you cannot accomplish loving God if you do not love others.
Yeah.
You can't say something like this, well, God I like, it's just people I don't like, right? and we all kind of get that state, because there's some people that we struggle with, and we're not necessarily getting in what it looks like to like someone versus love someone. Right. That might be a whole different conversation for a different time. Yeah. But it is this as Chris said, we've got to recognize that truly being like Jesus, or another way that he framed it, authentic spirituality, really is about this, right? And it's way more than just checking off those boxes, right? Well, I did some time, I did this, I did this, but it's about expressing and living that out.
Yeah. And if I remember right, Chris made the point in the message that this supersedes, this is greater than, this is more important than any other thing that we would do for God or in the name of God. More important than any sort of financial sacrifice, or, last week we were talking about serving. Yeah. Right? That this trumps that. And not that means we don't do the other. Right. And this is the only thing, but that's how big a deal this is.
Yeah, and I think maybe even a way to say it is the things that we do for others is an expression of love. Yeah. Like if we serve just because we feel guilty or we feel commanded or it's a duty, we're missing it. In fact, there's a section of scripture. So I don't know, maybe I've been able, the privilege to perform, say, 70 weddings, somewhere around there. I don't totally keep count, but I could go back and count. Sure. Look at a file somewhere. There's a pretty common section of scripture that's read at weddings that have zero to do with weddings. I mean, it's applied to it, but I think if we've ever been to a wedding, we hear 1 Corinthians 13, right? And they read it, and it talks about love. It talks about all this sort of stuff. I'm like, oh, this applies. And it does. But really, what 1 Corinthians 13, why it's so interesting is that it is put right between two other chapters, 1 Corinthians 12, 1 Corinthians 14, and people are like, well, that's observant, right? But when you understand the context of 1 Corinthians 12 and 1 Corinthians 14, that's why it's important, because it talks about all these things that you have that are gifts from God and that you can serve and you can do. And right smack dab in the middle, it says this: you could have all of these gifts, you could have all of these things, but if you don't have love, it means very little. In fact, I grew up learning the King James Version, and the King James Version has some really interesting phrasing. And I remember memorizing 1 Corinthians 13 as a kid. And the way it describes it, without love, if you do it without love, you're like a clanging gong or a tinkling cymbal. Now, I have to tell you this. The 9-year-old in me, anytime I use the word tinkling, I just kind of giggle. But we're clearly taking this off the spiritual path right now, but it's kind of funny. It doesn't make a difference. If you think of a gong, it's just boom, right? It makes a noise and it goes away. Yeah. It doesn't have lasting impact. And that is this type of thing. When we look at 1 Corinthians 13, it says faith, hope, and love, right? I learned it faith, hope, and charity. That was a King James Version, right? Yeah. But it's another word for love. Yeah. Faith, hope, and love. It says the greatest of these is love. So it is fundamentally at the center of everything, but it is also a reminder, it is an expression of God. I love this when we go back and we talk about love, when we look at the attributes of God, when it says in Scripture that God is love. It doesn't say God is loving, right? God is the very embodiment of love, right? Love exists because of God. We understand love because of God. It's because he first loved us, it says in Scripture, right? There's so much here. And as we then, choose to live and walk in a way that says, I just don't want to just like Jesus, as we've been in this series, but I want to be like Jesus. Right. Love is essential in that. Yes. And how we express it is loving your neighbor. And as we're going to get into a second, if you don't know exactly a good barometer for am I really loving your neighbor, the last part of that sentence is as yourself.
As yourself.
Right?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think if we're going to be honest, as we're going to begin to move into the practical now of how do we do this, it's fair to acknowledge, even as the people that are sitting here in front of the camera, it's hard to love people.
Yeah.
I mean, I feel like we could just have a moment of silence after a statement like that for the truth to settle. But it's hard to love people. And just in the last 48 hours, there's been some people I've been struggling to love. And they're people that I like.
Yeah.
But so again, with things that we've heard so many times, I think it's often easy for us to sometimes bypass the difficulty of actually doing the thing. Right. Because cognitively, it's so deeply ingrained. We've heard it so many times. Mm-hmm. We hear it and we go, yep. Just like when you're asked a question in church, the answer is Jesus, and you don't even have to think about what the question was. Mm-hmm. You just say Jesus and you move on with your day.
That's right.
We know we're supposed to love. How do we do it, especially when it's hard?
Yeah.
And there was a quote that your wonderful wife, Kathy...
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that, by the way. I appreciate that. Kathy, if you are listening this week, you are wonderful. By the way, it's our anniversary Wednesday.
Happy anniversary.
20 years. Yeah. This is not your gift, the podcast, honey. I got to get out something better between then and there.
I would never let him do that.
Yeah, thank you. He is a friend.
But she had this quote that she pulled. And when you shared it with me, I mean, it definitely, it had an effect on me, but it sounded like the two of you were having a conversation about it as well. So the quote from Dan Pierce, who I honestly don't know. So
I don't know where that person was.
I love quotes from people that I don't know.
Yeah. So we could have just said C.S. Lewis, because isn't that the rule? When you don't know the person, you say C.S. Lewis.
Right,
Jesus, right, yes.
But Dan Pierce says, the next time you want to withhold your help or your love or your support for another, for whatever the reason, ask yourself a simple question. Do the reasons you want to withhold it reflect more on them or more on you? And which reasons do you want defining you forevermore? Mm-hmm. Why did you like that so much?
Oh, boy. Well, I think when we talk about withholding love, mm-hmm. the first thing that I want to clarify is there is a difference between loving someone and being a doormat, right? So it's not saying that if you love someone, you're going to be a doormat. Right? There's way too many abusive moments and misunderstanding, both abusive physically, emotionally, in some religious environments, right? Spiritual abuse that happens over that. So it's not saying that you have to be willing to be, manipulated or a doormat or whatever to love someone. So let's just clarify that. But the Bible just says this: love your enemies. That's a hard statement, right? Mm-hmm. It's not saying let your enemies crucify you. It's not saying let your enemies beat you. It's not saying those sort of things, but it's saying that I have to love them. So when I think about this and I find myself withholding love from someone, that really actually reflects on me. Yeah. Because there's really no out. And so what is it reflecting in that moment? Well, I think it depends. Sometimes I think it reflects a misunderstanding of love, right? Because that's what I said up front. Because sometimes the most loving thing you could do, and I want people to hear this, sometimes the most loving thing you can do is to set up boundaries with people.
Absolutely.
And to keep them at a distance. It doesn't mean you don't return their phone calls ever, even though there's sometimes that's an appropriate boundary, right? So I want to be very careful in not becoming prescriptive of what it looks like to set up a boundary or not to set up a boundary. Yeah. So if there's any question about whether you should set up this boundary or loving it not, we go back to the very first thing that we say almost all the time: ask God. Mm-hmm. And then if you don't have some clarity on that, come see me, come see John, give us an email, faithforward@cfcwired.org. We'd love to help you with that. If you're here in our local body, we'll connect you with one of us personally, or if you're not in our local body, we'll connect you with someone. Yeah. But I think what it is in those moments that I am thinking through this concept, and here's what it is: it reflects on me that love is something that needs to be earned. Mm. And the question is, if I'm to be like Jesus, right? That's what we're talking about. Does love have to be earned? If Jesus says, love your enemies yourself. Love your neighbors yourself and love your enemies. Right. And Jesus loved me while I was still dead in trespasses of sin. Yeah. And Ephesians chapter 2 says there's nothing I could have done to earn it. Yeah. Right. So I'm laying all of that out. And if I choose not to love someone, well, that's probably reflecting on me that I'm missing something about Jesus. Right. But more often than not, what I find myself in those moments is justifying it.
Yeah.
Because of my anger. And if you've ever been rejected by anyone, you've probably had some anger.
Yeah.
If you've ever had something in any way, shape, or form happen negative from someone towards you, you're going to have some anger. And by the way, maybe a different podcast, having anger isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's what you do with it, right? Or maybe you've got some rejection or maybe fear. I mean, there's been times where I've found myself where I felt like someone has hurt me, and I feel like God is calling me to love them at a little more extensive level than I've currently been doing.
Yeah.
And I'll be honest, God, I'm not a big fan of that idea, because last time I walked into that idea, this pain happened, this hurt happened.
Right.
And that's when I really have to struggle with this idea, if this is God asking me to do it, because God clearly is always asking us to love, but I'm saying when he's asking us to go a little bit deeper into that, if it's God's voice saying that, well, he's not going to have something to do for me to do that's not in my best interest in his glory.
Right.
Even it doesn't say it's not going to be painful.
Right.
But it's actually in my sanctifying, becoming more like Jesus' interest.
Yeah.
So that is really kind of one of the things that I thought about that, because I think naturally, for many of us, myself included, when we withhold love, we think it reflects more on the character of the other person.
Totally. Yep.
But more often than not, if we're complete withholding, it really reflects more on our character.
It does. It does. And it's funny, this quote and everything you just said was reminding me of the last 48 hours with some people that I like, that I was struggling to love.
Yeah.
And it was reminding me that what it was reflecting, what it was revealing, what it was bringing up was, and so it was funny the progression of thought that happened, and that God was very kindly showing me. And so one of the things I was realizing is I'm frustrated with others oftentimes for not doing more or being better. Right? That there is so much available in this life with God. Right? There's amazing things that God makes possible. And it breaks my heart when I see people that are willing to just dip a toe in repeatedly and call that good. Right? You're at the best restaurant ever and you settle for a salad. Right? Like there's something in me that it just makes me sad.
Yeah.
And so I recognize there's a healthy part of this. Like if you take somebody to the best restaurant ever and they order a salad, I feel like you could be a little justifiably tweaked that they passed up on all these other good things.
Yeah, it depends. If I was paying the bill, I'm glad they took the cheap end out.
Right.
It's a win for me. Right. But that's a different discussion.
Right. There are absolutely exceptions to the rule here. Yeah. But I was recognizing that often when I struggle with people, often when I struggle to love people, this is one of the things that comes up most often, right? I want them to do better and be better.
Yeah.
And I realized yet again that that's because so often that's how I treat myself.
Yeah.
That so often that's the pressure I put on myself to do better and be better, right? And so getting back to this point about loving others, loving your neighbor as yourself, that's the call to in the best possible way, because it's assumed that you would never harm yourself. And so even if you were tempted to harm others, but you would never harm yourself, then love others like you love yourself. You'd never hurt yourself. Let's never hurt others, right? Yeah. You are something valuable. You're sacred. You're special. Love others like that. But so often I think what we discover to be the truth is I do love others the way that I love myself. And the way that I love myself isn't always very loving. And so having this realization yet again just this morning of just how often I apply this do better, be better to myself, and then it's no wonder that I'm applying it to others as I'm trying to love them.
Yeah, and hopefully that people are hearing this and they're kind of like, oh, I can relate to that. Maybe that's some insight. Something maybe, for me that they can relate to when you were saying that. I'm similar to that, but this is the one that when I struggle loving. When people keep coming back with the same problem and haven't done the last thing that we talked about.
Yep.
Right? I've been known when I got frustrated to say, don't waste my time. We're going over the exact same thing, right, for the third or fourth time, and you've not done it every time, and you wonder why you keep going there. And there's part of me that is a okay thing to say, but rarely is it out of love.
Right.
Because there's no greater person than Jesus ever had to have patience with than me. Right? Because how many times Jesus could have said, hey, Bales, this is the 13,000th time. we have talked about this and you're not doing the work on this. And now you're coming back to me again and going, God, why is this going wrong?
Yep.
But he never shames, never that. So a lot of times that's a reflection of me and the things that I get frustrated with. Does it make it right what the other person has done? I'm not saying it makes that right, but what I'm saying, it's an insight into me, why I'm struggling in that moment, why I'm withholding love.
Yeah.
Because it's reflecting something on me.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so there is, I think, at some point, there's some self-care that we have to address, and there's just some self-awareness that we have to have. You know, Jesus says the greatest commandment is to love the Lord your God with all your heart.
Yeah.
And love your neighbor as yourself. There's some heart level things that I think we need to address. And so I'm realizing this morning, yet again, I need to readdress for the 13,000th time this do better, be better in myself that I apply to others. And I was realizing yet again this morning that as I'm trying to love God with my whole heart, the current state of my heart believes that there's a part of God that's really focused on do better, be better with me.
Yeah.
And there is an element to that, right? That God does want my continued development and becoming. But there's also the part where God looks at me right now today and says, I love you. I mean, you'll probably break into Billy Joel here, but I love you just the way you are.
Hey, don't go changing.
Don't go changing.
Yeah.
and so this, you know, the reality and the realization that there is this ongoing development within me as I am trying to love others better, that's going to necessitate me continuing to learn how to love myself and continuing to learn how to love God and who the God is that I'm loving.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that was just this morning. So I don't, you know, it was a good day.
Yeah.
But I also feel like when we deal with a section of scripture like this that comes up often in the church calendar, and rightfully so, because it's the greatest commandment.
Yeah, and I want to pause there for a moment.
Yeah.
For if we're going to ever pick a section of scripture to preach over and over and over again, outside of the death, burial, and resurrection and the redemptive work that happened on the cross, this is the one.
Yeah.
This is the one. Because, you know, what we say all the time, sanctification is that process of becoming more like Jesus, right? Where the Holy Spirit is working in us to take our mind, our emotions, and our will, also known as our soul, right? And making them, conforming them more to be like Jesus. There is probably there's no silver bullet, but if we were going to give one, right, to the most sanctifying, the most conforming to the image of Jesus Christ, becoming like Jesus and being like him ever, it is learning to love the way Jesus has taught us to love.
Yes.
If we had to pick one. So people are like, I've been waiting, I don't know how many weeks in this podcast to get to the one thing. I'm done. I'm not listening anymore. But we can flesh that out a lot because, you know, that's where some of the complications come into. Okay, I'll take this. I'm supposed to love, but what does that look like?
Right. And I feel like so often when we hear a message like this and we're convicted or we're reconvicted for the 13,000th time, I feel like, especially as Westerners, as 21st century Americans in many cases, one of our default responses to being convicted is to rush right out and do as much of that thing as possible. And I was thinking about it this morning as I was dealing with all of this again. And I don't know why, but so often the imagery that God seems to bring to mind for me has to do with fitness. And that doesn't make any sense to me because I'm not and never have been a gym rat.
Sure.
I don't like going to the gym. The gym is not my happy place.
Yeah.
I understand there are plenty of people that do. We're friends with several people that are personal trainers.
Yeah.
God bless them. But that's just not my place. And yet the number of times that sort of imagery comes to mind as I feel like God is helping me understand spiritual concepts just doesn't make sense to me. But be that as it may. So 21st century Americans, we rush right out the door to fix the problem as soon as it's discovered.
Sure.
And that feels a little bit like if you hadn't been going to the gym for a while and you suddenly remembered that I need to be healthier, you go into the gym and you blast out like 500 squats. Now, I feel like any personal trainer would tell you that's dumb.
Yeah.
Don't do that because you're actually not making up for lost time. You're actually setting yourself further back because are you going to be able to walk tomorrow?
Or the day after
or
at
the
my
rest
age.
of the week.
Oh, yeah, exactly.
Right? And you're probably going to rupture a few things.
Yeah.
And so in this attempt to go and do a whole bunch to make up for lost time, you're actually not helping yourself, and you're not helping the people around you. And any personal trainer worth their salt, I feel like, would probably say, hey, it's been a while. Why don't we do this? Why don't you take 15 minutes on the bike? And then let's do a couple of, sets of, lightweight, low impact, just to sort of get back in the flow. And then you know what I would really love to see you do? Come back tomorrow.
Yeah.
Right? That makes so much more sense when I hear it laid out that way. Mm-hmm. And yet I know that so often my first impulse to a moment of conviction, maybe like this message of, I really need to be loving others. I need to be loving others that aren't like me.
Yeah.
Is to just go rush right out and go do all of those things. And it feels like God's invitation so often is, yes, go love people, but let's ease our way into this a little bit.
Yeah, and we've mentioned this before, but I think it serves as a reminder here. The same God of the universe that created how your physical body worked is the same God of the universe that ordered how our spiritual bodies work, right? And we have this sort of lean in or belief, right? That because it's spiritual, God is going to work differently.
Yes.
Now, here's the thing. He can.
Absolutely.
He can, but more often than not, it works like the physical body works. But on the same time, he could do the same miracle in our physical bodies.
Yep.
We could go in if he wanted to, but more often than not, this is the process of how it works. Yeah. And so we're not saying that God can't do miracles.
Absolutely.
We're not saying that God wouldn't do a miracle if he did that. But what we're saying is wisdom says this is not how it typically works, because what we do see is people motivated sometimes by a good message. Sometimes, truthfully, if we're not really hearing the Spirit well, we're motivated by guilt.
Absolutely.
And that's a whole nother issue.
Yeah.
And so we run out and we do all this sort of stuff. And then, they do it for a week. They do it for 2 weeks. They do it for 3 weeks. And then they're burnt out. They're like, I'm not in this, right? And it's not because doing it is wrong. It's how we've gone at it. Right. And also what we're going to get into in a moment here, what we understand about it. I don't know if you've ever seen those YouTube videos for like gym fails. They're kind of funny. You can get down don't go there now. But you see people on machines or on that sort of stuff. I'm assuming that they weren't just making it up to get on YouTube, right? I'm assuming that the people doing them were well-intentioned. Yeah. However, they completely did not understand the apparatus or the machine or the dumbbell that they were working with. And at minimum, it's good comedy. At a bigger sense, it's dangerous. Right? It's very dangerous. And it could lead to all kinds of misconceptions and hurts physically. Yeah. And, I think it's the same way in our spiritual life. When we think about this idea, loving others well, we have to really understand how to do that, what that looks like in that way. Yeah,
absolutely. And so, again, we always promise and we try to deliver on that promise that we want this to be practical.
Sure, yeah.
Right? So how do I love people well? And so some of the things that I think we've already tried to hit on, and maybe it wasn't laid out nuts and bolts step one, but to love others well, we have to learn how to love ourselves well and be honest about how we're currently loving ourselves. And we have to start with loving God and being honest about how we're loving God and the view of the God that we're trying to love.
That's right.
So all of that is a giant step one that we'll spend the rest of our life doing.
Yeah.
There are some other practical steps that I think we'll find useful. And so one of them is just the kindness that we can do ourselves of being reminded that you're not supposed to love everyone the same way.
Yep.
And this, honestly, it took me back to college. My freshman year humanities class, they had us read C.S. Lewis's Four Loves. I have not read it since then, but apparently my professor did a really good job because it's still in
your head. Yeah.
It's still in there. But Lewis walks through these 4 different types of love. I do not have them all memorized. So, but there's eros, which is passionate love.
Sure.
There's philia, which is friendship, brotherhood. There's storge, which is paternal, maternal, right? Parent to a child. And then agape, which is the love of all humanity, which is the one that usually comes up, I feel like, in church messages, because that's God's love for all humanity. And what I thought was so brilliant, just in thinking about this and having that college knowledge come back, was that it's an invitation to love people well, but differently.
Sure. And I think that, when we break that out, so those are the Greek words, right? There's a couple Hebrew words that I think that come in from time to time. One of the best ones is the word hesed, is one of my favorite words. And that is God's covenantal, the vast majority of times is used for God because it's his unerring, unfailing, never giving up, chasing you down type of love, right? I love that. Has nothing to do with this, but I love that. That's the thing about it. But yeah, no, I mean, in understanding relationships and what it looks like in there, it's helpful when we think about love. D.A. Carson, who is a theologian, wrote a book that's about yay thick, that is about this thick in theology and yay thick here, called The Difficult Doctrine of the Love of God, right? And what he's trying to get at is a lot of the same things that you're getting at here, is that we make an error if we think everything has to look the same, right? That somehow, if this doesn't happen here, I don't love that person.
Right. Or
this doesn't happen here, love. So there is understanding context, it's understanding relationship, and it does say love your enemy. So that means that I would have to love someone, for example, who wanted to take my life.
Yeah.
But the context and the relationship of that, how that happened, that's really, really key, right? I certainly hope that I would never choose to live in the same house with them as I choose to live in the same house with my wife, who, would have different types of love under the Greek aspect of it, right?
Right.
So I think that's giving people the freedom, right, in this moment, and that's what we're trying to do, is to understand that love does not look the same to every person, and every person isn't supposed to get the same type of love. They're supposed to get love, right? Yeah. There's some very key things that should be, just for some people and just for some people.
Absolutely. So. And I feel like that helps to take some of the pressure off as well, because again, you hear a message like this, you feel like you've been slacking, whether you have or not, the guilt comes in, or the fear or the shame or the whatever. And it's, I need to go rush out and find the first stranger that I can and bring them into my home and feed them and care for them, or I'm not being loving. Right. And the reality that could be what God's asking you to do. Going back to point number one, ask God.
Yeah.
And if God says, that's the way I want you to love that person, then you do that. But too often, I think we try to take good intentions and good knowledge and make it prescriptive.
Yeah.
Right. And so we want to cover all of this with ask God how to love the people in your life, but do it with the understanding that people are people and they're not a process. And they're not supposed to all be loved the same way. We were also talking right before we hit record that one of the other things that we often do that is well-intentioned but not always helpful is we love people the way that we want to be loved.
Well, I mean, it does say love your neighbor as yourself.
It does.
But we got to unpack that a little bit, right? Because we read that sometimes, love your neighbor as yourself, and we think, okay, this is how I feel loved.
Yeah.
So, of course, this is how they should feel loved.
Right. It makes total sense.
And we can stumble into that every once in a while. But I think all of us at some point or another have had a moment where we felt like we're loving someone, and, to use an old football analogy, we get the Heisman, right? The stiff arm. Like, whoa, hold on. And it feels, hollow or vapid or whatever term we want to use. So I've had the privilege, as I said, to do a lot of weddings. I've also had the privilege of doing what I would like to call marital crisis counseling.
Right.
And I can tell you, there's some things that over the years I've seen happen. One is I've never met a couple in premarital that ever says, I want to be at a place in my marriage where I feel like the spouse doesn't love me, right? No one's ever said my goal is to be divorced someday, or that I feel like I'm in a loveless marriage.
Yeah.
No. However, I have had the opportunity and the privilege to walk people through what God would have to say about their lives in moments where they feel that way.
Yeah.
And I think what's really, really interesting is that there have been times where I've had the privilege to engage people, and it's clear that they are not connecting on how to love each other, because one spouse will say, I don't feel like you love me, or vice versa. You don't love me. I always try to teach them to say, I don't feel. Those are better statements, right?
Those are better statements.
But sometimes it comes out, you don't, right? But nonetheless, and the other one, looks at them like they're living in a completely different universe.
Right.
And sometimes they'll even go about expressing all of the things that they believe justify that they love this other person. Mm-hmm. And in those moments, it becomes unbelievably clear. The problem isn't that they're in a loveless marriage per se. Right. The problem is they're in a marriage where they're not loving the other as the other person needs to be loved.
Yeah.
Right? And so when it says love your neighbor as yourself, it does not mean love them the exact way you want someone to love you, but to treat them with the care and the kindness that you would want someone to treat towards you. And so to do that to another human being, whether that's a spouse, whether it's a friend, whether it's a family member, a coworker, a neighbor, whatever it might be, it requires a level of investment, mm-hmm. right? Investment of knowledge and investment of time to get to know them. Now, again, every time God can say, do this, right? And if he says it, we do it because we know what's in the best. But barring a clear direction from God, that's what it requires, knowing some of these things.
Absolutely.
So,
one of the classic, marriage books that I feel like is genuinely helpful for people is mm-hmm. the 5 Love Languages book. Right?
And it doesn't even need for marriage. It helps
for anybody, just interpersonal, communication. But that, I think I've found that to be a really helpful tool for me in the way that I relate, not only to my spouse, like mm-hmm. you said, but to my friends.
Yeah.
And becoming aware of the ways that make me feel most loved, because I think quite often it's, your normal is your normal.
Right.
Right. And so it can become just sort of a subconscious reaction to, well, this is what I do because this, and we never actually investigate it, but realizing that, if words of affirmation is your thing and you really need that sort of attaboy, from time to time, that doesn't necessarily mean everybody else does.
Yeah.
Right. Or, acts of service or physical touch, pandemic, whatever, it's difficult. But just the recognition that the way that I want to be loved mm-hmm. is not necessarily the default for everybody else. And again, going back to the different kinds of love, you can't learn the love languages of every single person on the planet.
No.
I mean, you can barely do that with just, the circle of people that you are closest to. But like you said, developing an awareness, becoming a student of the people that are in that closest circle to you to learn how to love them well mm-hmm. and becoming aware of how you can be loved well, because that's part of that self-care. Yeah,
it just hit me for a moment. There may be people just hearing 5 love languages for the first time. So let me give a quick little explanation. So it's a book by Gary Chapman. And his premise is that love can be expressed in 5 different ways. Right? Mm-hmm. He talks about acts of service, gifts, quality time, touch, and words of affirmation. Mm-hmm. Those are the 5. And it just helps you understand how you feel most cared or loved for. And I think what happens a lot of times is whether we know our love language, we feel our love language, right? So mine is acts of service. Mm-hmm. It's a big one. And I realized that for much of my life, the way I would show someone I cared for them is the same way that I felt cared for, right? Now, that's good if someone's an active service person. It's not if they're not. So, quick story. My wife is not an active service person. She's a words of affirmation person. Yeah. And sometimes us acts of service people struggle with words of affirmation. I remember when we were dating, she had this vehicle, this red Ford Probe, and she traveled a lot back and forth to what she was doing. It was about a 35-minute drive. So she always carried a lot of clothes with her so she could do that. And so this is an old joke, but I felt like there was enough shoes in there to be Imelda Marcos for those of you who are of a certain age. And so one day I went to her apartment. She was somewhere. I got her keys from her roommate. Mm-hmm. And I washed her car. I cleaned her car. I did all of that sort of stuff. Right? All of that because, see, act of service. That's the way I show love, right? And the truth be told, her car drove me nuts. Right? So if you think about it, I would have thought, that's right. That's right. So I remember I cleaned out the car, did all that sort of stuff. And this was, back in the day where cell phones weren't, as handy. And I remember just leaving it there, not saying anything, that sort of stuff. And I left, just waiting for the phone call. Sure. Like, oh, this is the greatest thing you've ever done. Zero. Nothing. Nothing. And it wasn't, I want to hear this, it wasn't that she didn't value it. Right. But her dad also used to do that for her. It was something I learned in that moment, I would have gotten more bang for my buck with my girlfriend at the time, now my wife, some 20 some odd years later. I would have got more bang for my buck if I would have said, man, I just really appreciate how hard that you work. Yeah. Right? Or you look really good in this. Yeah. And I was like, I took 2.5 hours for that car. Right. And that's an example of, at that point, I felt like she didn't care about me. She didn't say thank you. Right? But the problem was twofold. One, I was loving like I wanted to be loved.
Exactly.
Right? If someone cleaned my car and it was that bad, I'd felt loved.
Yeah.
But also I just assumed everyone was wired like me. Right? And so she knows at the same time. She could say, hey, you look really good in that. And I'm like, thanks. It doesn't, and it doesn't mean I feel like that I look good. It just means that's not my thing.
Right.
And so understanding practically how you're wired, and then especially the people in the inner circle, how they're wired will help you love more effectively. So we do highly recommend that book. There's different things you can get out there. And that's just love languages. Things like personality profiles, your Myers-Briggs, or if you're into Enneagram or whatever those, all of those give us information about how God has uniquely wired every individual. And then we can choose, again, without God saying, do this exactly, to say, in light of this information, what would it look like to love this person really, really well? Right. I have to do that with my kids. I think someone once told me that they were parenting people, they were running parenting class, and they were like, I don't know how my kids turned out that way. I parented them both the same way. And they're like, well, that's your first problem. That's your first problem. You don't parent, and you don't even love the same way. I got two kids that exited from the same gene pool, but on opposite ends of the pool. And you've heard me say that before. They are vastly different human beings. I can't parent them the same way, and how I express love to them. One looks vastly different than the other. Yeah. And it's incumbent upon me as their father to know that. And to feed into that, and to teach them what they look like, so eventually when they're in relationships, so they can do better. So.
Exactly. And that story with you and Kathy, that has so much value for us as an example as we're trying to figure out how to love. Because I know that there are people that have had experiences like that with a close loved one, with a neighbor, with a coworker, where they feel like, I have tried to love them, and it's just not working. And that may just be. Yeah. But it could just be that our approach in trying to love was well-intentioned but misguided.
To give a little bit of plug about what I said last Sunday, what happens if you're trying with the right desire but going about it the wrong way? When we talk about service, the same thing when loving others. I believe there are times that we have the right desire, but we're going about it the wrong way, and then we draw conclusions about what it looks like to love each other that isn't accurate.
Yeah. And those conclusions, like we've talked about before, are either towards others or towards ourselves, or towards God. And all of that creates a little bit of static the further that we go with it. And so what we have to do is be able to go back to those moments and process through, right? To get rid of some of that misunderstanding or miscommunication or confusion. It's healthy not only for the relationship, but just as we're trying to love God from our heart, love our neighbor, and love ourselves. That's right. Man. Turns out we could talk about this for a while.
Well, I'm pretty sure you and I could talk about an oak tree for a while, but hopefully we talked about it was helpful, right?
That is all.
But people will let us know, right? They should let us know.
They should.
How can they let us know?
So faithforward@CFC Wired. The emails continue to come in slowly but surely. And again, you're not obligated to send us feedback, but as is so often the case, and we don't need the validation, but the goal is for this to be practical. And so if you have sat through however many weeks of this new version we now have, and it's not been practical, please let us know.
That's right.
But if it is, just
please let us know.
Please let us know.
Because we'll continue doing what we're doing in this way.
Absolutely. Because this really is, in part, an act of love on our part.
That's right.
Right? And for me in particular, wired as a teacher, giving people practical tools and continuing to develop myself, right, in these areas. And so we want to make sure that we're loving well. And we're loving you all in the way that is helpful. So
maybe loving them just the way they are.
That was good.
Thanks.
But don't go changing.
Yeah.
And on that note, he's Brian, I'm John. Thank you for being part of this Faith Forward channel, and we'll see you all next time.